I did quite a bit of writing on it through the early 70s and mid 70s and eventually did a book in 1979. And this process of solution is something that, I developed a long time ago. And the mathematic challenges of this are not difficult, really. We had given three categoric faults of the system. The third is systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. And to finish up with, how we solve that, it sounds like a very obtuse thing to be able to solve. But when you dissolve what we're looking at in the way of economy to its parts, what we find is that the obfuscation of the currency is such that it only has the power to corrupt the volume or disposition of the circulation or the cost of the circulation through interest and through, let's say, withholding credit. So, in effect, since we've solved the volumetric faults or corruption with our first solution of inflation and deflation, and since we've eradicated interest with our third solution of inherent irreversible multiplication of artificial indebtedness in proportion to a circulation, so we've also solved systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property because we've eradicated the only powers to do so. So that's why it's mathematically perfected economy. And as I said, this thesis of inherent failure is something that, I came up with originally in the late 60s, 1968 to be exact. And yes, it's a cause of worldwide monetary failure. We'd expect, political figures who represented the people to readily recognize that there were faults, even back in the late 60s or early 70s. I kept track of these things, because they were obvious everywhere around you. But, I was raised in a house which was purchased in a brand new colonial house built in 1963 for $35,000 here. And, by the end of that decade, 5-6 years later, houses down the street were built with, cheaper materials, not as much natural wood inside, so on and so forth. But they were 3 times the cost already. So you could see all these things happening then. People weren't as concerned about it, but they should have been because, it was a continual process of erosion of, let's say, possibility of sustaining a standard of living, which was ascertainable and relatively obvious back then. In fact, it's really obvious throughout the lifespan of such a system because the cost of everything is inherently increased by this obfuscated currency. So as it multiplies debt in proportion to a circulation, and as industry is the engine, so to speak, of affording these increasing costs, the costs of increasing indebtedness are saddled upon industry, forcing industry to perpetually increase its prices at, in fact, an ever-escalating rate, merely to maintain margins of solubility. So anyway, we could see the world economies coming to an end from way back then, and in fact from the beginning of any instance of any such system. As soon as the Federal Reserve System became active in the United States, you could see these consequences. All the things that have manifested today, what we call false bubbles, for instance, are a phenomena which naturally, or we could say unnaturally, arises in any such system as schemes get more outlandish to try and beat the system to its own end. In the end, the music stops playing. Everyone who's in debt, their debts are called, they're unable to service them, and the whole thing comes down like the proverbial house of cards. As I was saying earlier, I've presented mathematically perfected economy to every United States president since including Gerald Ford. And the Reagan administration was perhaps the most receptive. I would say when Jerry Brown ran for president, his close friends, adopted this idea, encouraged him to take me up on it, and he did nothing. But the Reagan people were very interested in this. And during the '79 presidential campaign, I responded to Reagan, who proposed that he could decrease federal tax rates 10% per year for 3 years, and that would balance the federal budget and offset inflation. I wrote him proposing that, on the contrary, that I could prove the economy would eventually fail, and possibly soon. At the time, we had 14% and upward prime interest rates. That is, the base rate that the Federal Reserve banks charge was 14% and even upwards of that. We had double-digit price inflation. Jimmy Carter had accumulated $150 billion of federal debt in over 4 years, and Reagan turned the campaigns between the debates between the candidates when he famously turned to Carter and pronounced that $150 billion of federal debt as, quote, unforgivable, unquote. Anyway, I wrote the Reagan administration, and I offered to prove that the economy would fail, possibly very soon, that Reagan would accumulate more federal debt than any president before him, that it was mathematically impossible to reducing federal tax rates 10% per year would balance the federal budget or offset price inflation, as he claimed, and that there was one and one only solution for the problems that he was facing, and that solution was mathematically perfected economy. In fact, I presented the Reagan campaign with a actual prescription, which still stands unrefuted, of how to save any such economy. That would be the economy of Australia, the economy of the United States, the economy of Iceland, the economy of New Zealand, everywhere, in a single day, and a prescription for converting it to mathematically perfected economy within a matter of days or a few weeks at most. Basically, the issues that we're suffering from in failure are that we're paying so much money out of circulation in servicing the debt that is already so great that the people are no longer creditworthy to borrow further to sustain a vital circulation. And this is why all of the governments of the world have, it isn't their direct reasoning or rationale, but it's why they're forced to persist in what I call federal overspending. In other words, if it weren't for federal overspending, replenishing the circulation as we're paying it out of circulation, we would already be in failure. And it's not that that's a solution for the fundamental faults, but it's what's preserved us a while longer in the end. It's also why these bank rescue plans and whatnot are going to fail. They don't solve the fundamental cause of the failure, which is inherent, irreversible multiplication of artificial indebtedness in proportion to capacity to pay. In fact, all these rescue plans are increasing the indebtedness even further, which only is going to exacerbate the rate of failure when these artificial sustentions of the final days of these systems ultimately fail, because the debt continues to increase at an ever-escalating rate. And that means that these bailout plans, likewise, would have to increase at an ever-escalating rate. And, of course, there's no way in the world that we can ever pay them off. So eventually, when our payments against debt are greater than the bailouts, then we go down for good. And we're on the cusp of that. So it behooves all of us to give pause and evaluate our circumstances and realize that indeed there is one and one only solution for the fundamental faults which cause these inherent failures. And I guess we could exemplify this by discussing the Reagan administration even further. There were insiders who were quite interested in this, and of course, it's not difficult to demonstrate or prove mathematically that if a president proposes that decreasing federal tax rates 10% per year for 3 years is going to offset inflation, that being as the federal taxes only are a part of all things and the cost of all things is increasing more than 10%, obviously decreasing federal tax rates 10% is not going to even offset price inflation exceeding that. So I predicted that things were going to get far worse. I explained to the Reagan administration that they were going to accumulate more debt than any president before them as a consequence of the obfuscation of the currency.